He wouldn't let anyone near him, not the shelter workers, not other dogs, not even the kindest voices. But then a veterinarian did something no one else had the courage to do. He brought in a bowl of food, sat down inside the cage, and waited. What happened next? It will restore your faith in humanity and in dogs like him. He had no name, only a case number, no bark, no growl, no tail wag, just a pair of terrified eyes that tracked every movement in the room from the furthest, darkest corner of the kennel. When Dr. Grant Walker first saw him, the shelter staff only had one warning: he doesn't trust anyone, not yet, maybe never. The dog had been picked up 2 weeks earlier, wandering near an abandoned mill on the edge of town. He was skin and bones, with patches of missing fur and a crust of dried blood behind one ear, a collar so tight it had to be cut off. No microchip, no record, no history, only fear. He didn't bark, he didn't bite, he just froze when anyone approached, and hid in the back corner of the kennel like a prisoner who had accepted a life sentence. Dr. Grant had worked with trauma dogs before. 20 years in animal care had taught him one thing: you don't fix dogs like him with commands, you fix them with presents. So the next morning, while the staff watched from the hall, Grant stepped into the kennel. He didn't bring a leash, he didn't bring gloves, he brought a lunchbox and a blanket, and he sat down. The German shepherd watched him, tense, trembling eyes unblinking. Grant didn't look at him. He opened his food, placed a second bowl a few feet away, and began eating quietly. No talking, no reaching, no pressure, just sharing space. He came back the next day, and the next, and the next, always with food, always sitting quietly, always letting the dog decide if it was safe. He started calling him Bruno, not because the dog responded to it, he didn't, but because the dog needed something other than a number. By day 5 something changed. Bruno stopped shaking when Grant entered the cage. He still stayed in the corner, but his eyes no longer darted, they studied. Grant smiled to himself. He's starting to see me as something other than a threat. On day 8, Bruno took a single step forward, just one. He didn't eat, he didn't sniff, sniff, he just moved one paw forward and stood there halfway between fear and instinct, and that was enough for Grant to feel it. The wall was cracking, but what no one expected was what Bruno would do on the 12th day, a moment that would leave the entire shelter in silence and change both their lives forever. Day 12 started like all the others. Dr. Grant entered the shelter, quietly nodded at the front desk staff, signed in on the logbook, and walked the familiar hallway. The smell of bleach, the soft barking in the distance, the metallic echo of footsteps on concrete. But inside Kennel 17 it was silent as always, except something felt different. Bruno was already awake, sitting, not crouching in his usual corner. His eyes followed Grant's every movement as he approached the gate. No growl, no bark, no shift backward. Grant paused at the door, holding the lunchbox in one hand and the same folded blanket in the other. Morning, big guy, he said softly, knowing the words meant nothing yet, but maybe the tone did. He opened the latch, stepped inside slowly, and sat cross-legged on the floor, back against the opposite wall like he had for the past 11 days. He placed the food bowl about 4 feet in front of him and set his own meal down beside it. Then he waited, just like always, but Bruno didn't retreat. He didn't pace, he didn't shake. Instead he stood, and for the first time he took 3 full steps toward the food bowl. Grant stayed completely still, holding his breath without realizing it. Bruno's head lowered. He sniffed the air. One step closer, then another. He reached the bowl. He didn't eat, he just nudged it gently with his nose, then turned his gaze directly toward Grant. A long silent stare, not of Challenge not of fear but of question. Are you safe? Can I trust this? Are you really here for me? Grant didn't move, didn't speak. He just waited, lowering his eyes in a slow, deliberate motion, inviting, not intimidating. That's when it happened. Bruno stepped around the bowl and walked toward Grant, not rushed, not aggressive, just cautious, tentative, hopeful. He stopped about 2 feet away, close enough that Grant could hear his shallow breathing, close enough to see the soft scars along his muzzle, likely from years of chain tension. Grant could feel his own heartbeat in his throat. Don't move. Let him decide. Bruno lowered his head slowly and pressed his nose to Grant's knee just for a second, then pulled back. A moment, but a miracle. The shelter coordinator, who had been watching silently through the observation window, brought her hand to her mouth. Her name was Marcia, 48 years old, with soft gray streaks in her ponytail and decades of heartbreak behind her eyes. She whispered, "That's the first time he's touched anyone." Grant smiled gently, still not moving. After a few seconds, he spoke low, steady, "You did good, buddy." Bruno's ears twitched, then he eyed down right there, 2 feet from Grant, with his head resting on the floor. "And I still watching." From that day forward, everything changed. The sessions continued every day, rain or shine, but now Bruno would meet Grant at the gate. He still wouldn't accept a leash, wouldn't tolerate other people nearby, but he'd sit beside Grant, sometimes even lay his head on his lap for a few seconds before pulling away. Grant never forced it, he let it come in waves, slow and sacred, because rebuilding trust in a dog like Bruno isn't a straight line, it's a dance. 1 step forward, 2 back, pause, breathe, try again. Then came day 16. Grant arrived as usual, but something was wrong. Bruno wasn't sitting in the corner, he was pacing, ears back, tail low. There was food in the bowl from the night shift, untouched. Grant entered the kennel and knelt like always. Bruno ran to him faster than ever before and nudged his chest hard, then turned toward the kennel door and barked loud, urgent. Something was happening, and Bruno knew it. First, what happened next would test everything Grant had built and showed just how far Bruno was willing to go to protect the one person who never gave up on him. When Bruno barked, it wasn't like a typical warning, it was raw. It was sudden, and it sent chills down Grant's spine. The sound had weight, not from volume but from meaning, as if this dog, who had been silent for so long, could no longer hold something inside. Grant stood immediately. Bruno didn't back away, he stayed close, tail low but not tucked, looking toward the hallway outside the kennel gate. And then he barked again, 1 sharp burst, then another, this time more desperate, more direct. Marcia, the shelter coordinator, came running from the hallway. "What's going on?" she asked. Grant stepped to the gate and opened it cautiously. Bruno didn't hesitate, he walked out beside him, still barking now, turning his body toward the far end of the hallway. Suddenly a scream, it came from the back room, the small clinic where visiting techs treated new rescues and did emergency exams. Grant didn't think he ran, so did Bruno. When they reached the room, the door was slightly ajar. Inside, one of the vet techs, Mia, just 22 years old, new to the job, was on the floor, holding her ankle, clearly in pain. A collapsed metal shelf lay behind her, equipment scattered, a bottle of tranquilizer fluid broken on the ground. I slipped, tried to reach something high. Winced, I think I hit my head and my legs stuck. Grant rushed in. Marcia called 911 and Bruno, he didn't freeze, he stepped into the room and sat beside Mia. Then slowly, gently, he pressed his body against her arm, not in panic, not in confusion, in comfort. The same dog who wouldn't let a hand near his face 2 weeks ago was now sitting guard over a stranger. Mia's breathing slowed. She looked up at Grant, tears forming. He just sat with me like he knew. Grant nodded, crouching beside them. He did. No paramedics arrived minutes later. They gently lifted Mia onto a stretcher. Her ankle was twisted but not broken, a mild concussion. They said she'd be okay, but the story, it wouldn't go quietly. A paramedic had snapped a photo. Bruno sitting beside me, eyes wide, calm and present while she clutched his fur. It was uploaded that evening to the shelter's Facebook page, with the caption, "The dog who didn't bark for anyone barked to save someone." Today by morning it had over 40,000 shares. Donations started flooding in. Volunteers signed up in record numbers, and adoption applications nearly tripled. But no one asked for Bruno, because by now the world could tell Bruno wasn't just waiting to be rescued. He was already doing the rescuing. That night Grant sat in the kennel again, this time with the door open wide. Bruno lay beside him, head resting on his shoe, eyes half closed. "I didn't come here to change you," Grant whispered. "I just wanted you to feel safe." He reached down slowly and scratched behind Bruno's ear. For the first time Bruno didn't pull away. He leaned in. Later that week Grant submitted an application, not for medical care, not for a temporary foster, but for adoption. The staff cried when it was approved. Marcia hugged him longer than expected. "You didn't just save him," she said. "You reminded all of us why we do this." Bruno didn't need a cage anymore. He needed a home, and it was already waiting for him. But before leaving, Grant had one more idea, a way to help the others like Bruno, the ones no one notices. And he would start with the one place Bruno had never dared to enter. Outside. The day Bruno left the cage wasn't the day he left the shelter. It wasn't a celebration. It wasn't filmed or photographed. There were no good boy banners or happy music. It was just a door, a leash, and 2 steps toward the unknown. Dr. Grant had been preparing him for this moment for days, not with training commands or force, but with presence. Every afternoon he'd sit with Bruno just inside the gate, leash loosen, hand, door slightly cracked open, and every time Bruno would approach the edge, sniff the air, then back away, sometimes with his tail down, sometimes with his eyes wide, but always retreating. "He's afraid of the open," Marcia had said softly, watching from the window. One evening out there meant hunger, pain, abandonment. Grant nodded. Out there meant no one came back for him. So they waited every day a little closer to the edge, until one afternoon Bruno crossed it. It was quiet in the hallway, shelter closed, staff gone, just Grant and Bruno. Grant opened the door fully. This time he clipped the leash on, knelt beside him, and whispered, "You don't have to go far, just be with me." And Bruno stepped out, one paw, then another, his body low, tail uncertain, but moving. They didn't go outside yet, just the hallway, but for Bruno that was already a new world. For the next week Grant walked him further and further, each day through the back hallway, into the laundry room, down to the break area. Each time Bruno froze at a new sound, a door creaking, a dryer buzz, a distant bark. But he didn't bolt, he didn't panic. He looked at Grant, and when Grant crouched and offered a hand, Bruno came back every time. The first time they made it to the back door of the shelter, Grant opened it just an inch. Cold wind rushed in. Bruno stepped backward instantly, then stopped. He didn't hide. He stood there, watching the light outside flicker across the tiles. The next day Grant didn't open the door. He sat beside it. Bruno joined him. Together they listened to birds, wind, a far-off train horn, and for the first time Bruno wagged his tail just once. On day 10 it happened. Grant opened the door all the way. Bruno froze but didn't Retreat. Grant stepped outside then. Waited, no words, no leash pulling, just trust. Bruno stood there for nearly 2 minutes then. Slowly he followed. The shelter yard was empty, just grass, an old fence, and a few benches. Bruno walked with caution, head low, ears scanning. He sniffed to the air. Then the dirt, then the bench. Grant sat quietly, and Bruno came beside him, then did something no one expected. He laid down. Not tense, not curled up, but flat, relaxed, safe. Grant looked down his throat tight. He whispered, "Welcome back to the world, my friend." Bruno closed his eyes. The sun touched his fur for the first time in what felt like years, and he didn't flinch. The shelter staff watched through the window. Marcia wiped her eyes. He did it, she whispered. He walked through the door. Later that night, Grant emailed the board of directors. He proposed a new program. Bruno time, a daily routine where staff and volunteers would sit with long-term trauma dogs. No commands, no demands, just presence. It won't fix every dog, he wrote, but it might remind them they're still seen, and that might be enough. The proposal was approved. The next day, Bruno kept walking outside with Grant every day after that, but one afternoon as they reached the gate, Bruno paused. He turned his head, looked up, and let out a soft, low bark. Not fear, not warning, but something else. Readiness. And that's when Grant realized Bruno didn't just want a place to feel safe. He was ready for something even greater, to go home. The sky was overcast the morning Grant came to take Bruno home. No fanfare, no reporters, just a drizzle on the windows, the smell of damp concrete, and the nervous tension that hung in the air like fog. Bruno didn't understand what was happening. He stood beside Grant at the front counter of the shelter, tail still, ears twitching, Leon collar adjusted. But this wasn't a walk. Something was different. Marcia placed the paperwork gently on the desk. She looked up at Grant and said softly, "I've worked here 23 years. I've never seen a transformation like his." She reached over and touched Bruno's head. For the first time, he didn't pull away, just stood still, eyes locked on Grant. Hand at his side. The staff lined the hallway as they walked out. Some smiled, some cried, some just stood silent, soaking in the weight of the moment. Bruno paused once at the door, sniffed the frame, looked up at the sky beyond, then stepped through. Grant opened the back of the SUV. A thick foam bed was waiting, lined with a fleece blanket that smelled like Grant's home. Bruno hesitated, then jumped in, clumsy but confident for a dog who once wouldn't cross a doorway. This was a leap. Grant slid into the driver's seat and sat still for a moment, hands on the wheel. Then he exhaled. "You're not a shelter dog anymore, Bruno, you're family." Now the ride was quiet. Bruno lay down, watching the road through the window. He didn't sleep. He studied, observed, trusted. Grant's home was modest, a one-story ranch house near the woods on the edge of town, a wide backyard fenced, peaceful, safe. He'd prepped it all: water bowls, orthopedic dog bed, a bin of toys, a name plate on the door that read Bruno's place. But when there they walked through the front door, Bruno stopped, tail low, head down, eyes darting. Something about the space made him tense. Maybe it was the quiet, or the unfamiliar smells, or the memory of what inside used to mean. Grant didn't force it. He sat on the floor beside him, unhooked the leash, and let Bruno choose. For 15 minutes Bruno stood frozen. Then he sniffed a chair, a table, the rug. He patted into the living room and circled the couch 3 times before curling up beside it, still on the floor, never jumping up. Grant sat nearby, quietly watching. When Bruno's head finally lowered to the carpet and his eyes began to close, Grant whispered, "Welcome home, boy." The next few days were both beautiful and fragile. Bruno followed Grant from to room. He learned the sounds Of the fridge, the buzz of the kettle, the way Grant laughed softly at old radio shows, but he also flinched when a drawer slammed too hard. He refused to eat unless Grant sat near. He barked once loudly at his own reflection in the hallway mirror. Recovery, it turned out, wasn't a finish line, it was a process. Then on the fifth night it happened. Grant had just turned off the lights, headed toward the bedroom. Bruno was curled on his bed near the back door, breathing steady until the storm rolled in. A loud clap of thunder cracked through the air, and Bruno panicked. He bolted into the hallway, nails scraping tile, body low, tail tucked. He ran to the bathroom, crawled into the shower, and shook. Grant found him there. He sat beside the tub and whispered gently. He didn't reach for him, didn't pull, he just spoke, and after a long silence, Bruno crawled forward, pressed his head into Grant's lap, and whimpered. That night they slept in the hallway on a blanket side by side, because some homes aren't built in a day. They're built one storm at a time. But the world hadn't forgotten Bruno, because a letter was about to arrive from someone who had seen his photo, someone who claimed to have known him before it all began. The envelope was plain, no return address, just Grant's name and the shelter's mailing address. It had been forwarded from the shelter after Bruno's adoption. At first Grant thought it was a donation letter or routine mail, but when he opened, he froze. Inside was a single photo. Puppy, small, fluffy ears, still floppy, licking peanut butter off the fingers of a little girl, maybe 5 or 6 years old. The background looked like a modest front porch. There was a wooden swing, a baby shoe, and a flower pot painted with the words Bruno's spot. Grant turned the photo over, written in pen. He was mine, please tell me he's okay. I've been looking for him for so long. See, the letter itself was short, slanted handwriting. I'm sorry if this is strange. I saw a picture of him on a Facebook post from the shelter. I know it's him. I raised him until he was about 2. We called him Bruno then. 2. My dad sold him when I was at school. I never forgave him. I've looked for Bruno for years, but we didn't have papers or chips. I thought I'd never see him again. Please just let me know he's okay, that he's safe. Grant sat in silence. His fingers shook as he read the note. Again and again he looked over at Bruno, who was asleep by the fireplace, legs twitching in a dream. Still, whole, still healing. Grant replied the next day. He included a photo of Bruno laying on the porch at home and a short message. Yes, he's okay, he's better than okay, he's home. He mailed it and never expected anything more. But a week later, the girl from the photo walked into his clinic, except she wasn't a little girl anymore. She was 19, with long brown hair tied in a braid and soft green eyes that looked heavier than they should. Her name was Chloe. She stood just inside the door, wringing her hands, trying not to cry. Can I see him? She asked. Grant paused, then nodded. Once Bruno was in the back room, napping as always on the blanket he dragged into his favorite corner. Grant knelt beside him and whispered, "Hey, buddy. You've got someone here." He clipped the leash on, gently walked him to the front. Bruno didn't bark, he didn't hide. He stopped in the doorway and looked straight at Chloe. Chloe dropped to her knees. She didn't call his name, she didn't move forward, she just whispered, "Bruno." Bruno's ears perked. He tilted his head, then cautiously he walked forward, step by step, until he was face to face with her. He sniffed her shirt, then her hands, then slowly he leaned in and pressed his head against her shoulder. Chloe began to cry. "I missed you, I'm so sorry." Bruno stayed right there, not shaking, not unsure, just still listening, remembering, forgiving. They sat there for nearly an hour. No one spoke. They didn't need to. When Grant offered her water, Chloe Smiled. I don't want to take him back, I just needed to know he didn't forget me. Grant nodded. He didn't. Before she left, she knelt beside Bruno. One last time, thank you for becoming everything I hoped you would. You were always brave. Then she turned to Grant. You gave him what I never could. Grant answered with the only words that felt right. He gave me even more. That night Bruno sat on the porch beside Grant, watching the stars. A soft breeze rustled the trees. Grant looked down. You okay, bud? Bruno looked up at him. His eyes weren't sad. They were clear, like a chapter had finally closed, and the weight of the unknown had finally lifted. But the story wasn't quite over, because 1 month later Grant would take Bruno somewhere he'd never been before, a place full of strangers, smells, chaos, but also purpose. The shelter had sent an invitation. It wasn't for Grant, it wasn't even for Bruno, it was for what they'd become, a symbol. The shelter was launching a new program. The ones who waited focused on long-term residents, dogs like Bruno, the ones no one picked at first, the ones who carried trauma like a shadow. They wanted Grant and Bruno to come and speak. Well, Grant would speak. Bruno just had to walk through the door. That alone would say enough. Grant wasn't sure it was a good idea. The last time Bruno had walked those hallways, he was terrified, silent, guarded. What if it brought the memories back? What if it was too much? But that night, as Bruno rested his head on Grant's foot in front of the fireplace, Grant whispered, "You tell me, boy, you ready?" Bruno looked up and wagged his tail. Once the event was small, just 30 people, volunteers, future adopters, shelter staff, but it felt big. There was a small stage, a banner with Bruno's picture, folded chairs, and silence when they walked in. Bruno didn't hesitate, he didn't flinch. He walked beside Grant, head high, ears forward, not like a survivor, like a leader. Grant spoke for 10 minutes. He told them about the kennel days, the first bowl of food, the moment Bruno laid his head in his lap. He told them about the storms, the hallway naps, and the letter. But when he said this, the room went still. Bruno didn't just come back from trauma, he became someone who could sit beside fear and not run from it. And now he's going to help others do the same. Grant stepped aside. Bruno stayed at the front, calm, still, until a boy in the third row, maybe 10 years old, stood up. He held a leash. Attached to it was a skittish, limping pit mix named Hazel. She trembled at the noise. The boy whispered, "Can we meet him?" Grant looked at Bruno. Bruno stepped forward, slow, gentle. He lowered his head and sniffed Hazel's ear. She didn't run, she leaned into him. The boy started crying. She's been through everything, and this is the first time she's touched another dog. Grant swallowed hard. Bruno knows, he said. That's why he's here. From that moment on, Bruno wasn't just Grant's dog, he became part of the program. Every Wednesday they returned to the shelter, not to visit, to work, to help. Bruno would sit in the center of the rehab room, calm, strong, safe. New dogs were brought in slowly, one at a time. Some barked, some growled, some shook uncontrollably. Bruno never flinched. He sat there, a living example that the broken don't stay broken, they heal, they guide, they become bridges for others. Marcia, the coordinator, once said, "There's a peace in him now that I can't explain." Like he was waiting for this role his whole life. Years passed. Bruno aged slower, steps wider, muzzle, but the same eyes, full of memory, full of soul, until one quiet morning Grant woke to find him sleeping beside the fireplace, just like always. But this time he didn't rise. There was no struggle, no fear, just peace, like a breath taken and never let out. Again they buried him at the edge of the woods behind Grant's house, under an oak tree where sunlight filtered through the branches like heaven. Whispering the Stone simply read Bruno, the one who waited. He didn't just survive, he gave others a reason to keep going. The shelter renamed the program in his honor. Now it's called Bruno's Way, a path of patience, compassion, and presence because of one dog who waited 6 months in a cage to save dozens more who might have waited forever. If this story touched your heart, remember this: sometimes the ones who've suffered the most become the strongest healers. Sheltered dogs like Bruno are not damaged, they're simply waiting for someone brave enough to see them. Subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and share the side story with someone who believes in second chances. Let's help more dogs like Bruno find not just homes but purpose.